Prime Minister has revealed that clemency has been granted for two Australian citizens facing the death penalty in Vietnam. Mr Albanese lobbied his Vietnamese counterpart to intervene on his trip over the weekend, and he said that the families of the two Australians are thankful. The Prime Minister attributed the breakthrough to improved relations between the two countries. For more on this, I spoke a short time ago to Elaine Pearson. She's Director of Asian Policy for the Human Rights Watch.
I think it's the outcome that every family hopes for, that a Prime Minister will raise the cases of people who are sitting on death row. I mean, the death penalty is barbaric. No one, Vietnamese or Australian, should be sentenced to death. And so certainly it's very encouraging that the Australian Prime Minister has raised these cases and that the Vietnamese government has acted. I hope that he also raised the cases of other Vietnamese who are sitting on death row, because, you know, the death penalty is something that the Australian government should be opposing in all circumstances.
The Prime Minister also apparently raised the case of another senior Australian who remains in jail, has been for some time in Vietnam, and that work remains ongoing. Do you welcome that?
Yeah, I think it's very important that the Australian Prime Minister raised the case of Chow Van Cam. We have been following this case very closely. He's someone who has spent more than 4 years in jail. He's elderly, in his 70s. He has, bad health, and he was convicted on terrorism charges and sentenced to 12 years in a case that mattered merely a number of hours and did not meet any semblance of due process. So I think it's very important that the Australian Prime Minister raised this case, and certainly the cases of other Vietnamese political prisoners, because this is a government that has no tolerance for dissent. And so it is important that when Australian leaders are travelling, that they raise these cases at the highest levels. And Chow Van Cam is someone who last year the UN determined that his detention is arbitrary and actually urged the Vietnamese government to take action on his case.
So we hope, there is development on that front as well. Are there other Australians on death row in the region? If so, how many are we talking about?
We don't track the number of Australians on death row, but, certainly we are really concerned that, from China to Singapore to Vietnam, the trend is that, we do still have people who are convicted and sentenced to death. I would say the one bright spot has been Malaysia, who recently abolished the mandatory death penalty for a number of offences. They haven't immediately commuted all of the people who've been already sentenced to death, but certainly that's an encouraging sign. And I hope that, not just with respect to Australians who are detained, but that the Australian government is raising these cases of the death penalty with all governments that retain the death penalty, including with the US government.
Yeah. And Elaine, we saw this immediate reaction to the Prime Minister's representations, clemency granted for two Australians in Vietnam. I wonder, do you have a sense of what the movement might be in China in relation to not the death penalty, but two Australians, high profile, Chung Lei and Yang Henjun, the author, who remain in prison? Do you get the sense that we might see some movements on that front ahead of a prime ministerial visit to Beijing later in the year?
Well, certainly, I hope so. I think Yang Hengjun and Chow Van Cam, they were picked up the same month. So, you're talking about two Australians who have been arbitrarily detained for more than 4 years. It's a long time to be in prison for anyone, but, certainly for these individuals. So I think for Chung Lei and Yang Hengjun, absolutely the Australian government has been steadfast in raising these cases. Ultimately, this is for the Chinese government to determine, but I think it's really important that at every opportunity, ministers, leaders, politicians should be making it very clear that these, cases matter, and that no one should be going to jail, simply for peaceful acts of free expression, and that Australia is paying very close attention to these cases, as it should, for any citizen who is being arbitrarily detained anywhere in the world.
Director of the Human Rights Watch's Asia Division, Elaine Pearson, joining me from Washington. Thanks, appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Kieran.